The story of Alexander the Great is one of the most extraordinary epics in human history, a breathtaking saga of ambition, conquest, and the relentless pursuit of glory that reshaped the ancient world forever. Born in 356 BC in Pella, the ancient capital of Macedonia, Alexander was destined for greatness from the very beginning. He was the son of King Philip II of Macedonia, a brilliant military reformer and strategist, and Queen Olympias, a deeply spiritual and fierce princess of Epirus who instilled in her son the belief that he was no ordinary mortal, but a descendant of heroes and gods, specifically the legendary Achilles and Heracles. From his earliest years, Alexander was groomed to rule. His education was unparalleled. When he was just 13 years old, his father hired one of the greatest minds in human history to be his tutor, the philosopher Aristotle. For 3 years, in the quiet village of Mieza, Aristotle taught the young prince rhetoric, literature, science, geography, and philosophy. Alexander fell deeply in love with Homer's Iliad, a book he would carry with him for the rest of his life, placing it under his pillow every night next to his dagger. This education did not just fill his mind with knowledge, it expanded his vision of the world, instilling in him a profound curiosity about distant lands and a belief that human potential was limitless. Alexander's physical and military training was equally rigorous. He proved his courage early on. When he was only 12 years old, he tamed a wild, magnificent black stallion named Bucephalus, which no one else could ride. Observing that the horse was merely afraid of its own shadow, Alexander turned its head toward the sun, spoke softly, and mounted it. His father, weeping with pride, famously told him, "My boy, you must find a kingdom big enough for your ambitions. Macedonia is too small for you." Bucephalus would become Alexander's loyal companion, carrying him through countless battles across thousands of miles. By the age of 18, Alexander was already commanding troops. At the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BC, he led the Macedonian cavalry with devastating effect, helping his father defeat the combined forces of Athens and Thebes, effectively bringing all of Greece under Macedonian hegemony. But the dynamics of the royal family were volatile. Philip married a younger Macedonian noblewoman, threatening Alexander's claim to the throne and causing a bitter rift. However, the internal conflict was cut short in 336 BC during a royal wedding celebration when King Philip was assassinated by one of his own bodyguards. At just 20 years old, Alexander was thrust onto the throne. He moved with terrifying speed to secure his power, eliminating potential rivals and brutally crushing rebellions in Greece, most notably in Thebes, which he razed to the ground as a warning to anyone who dared oppose him. With Greece firmly under his control, Alexander turned his eyes toward his father's ultimate dream, a grand invasion of the Persian Empire, the vast superpower of the ancient world that had menaced the Greek city-states for centuries. In 334 BC, Alexander crossed the Hellespont into Asia Minor with an army of roughly 32,000 infantry and over 5,000 cavalry. It was a diverse force, anchored by the formidable Macedonian phalanx, soldiers armed with the sarissa, a massive 18-foot pike, and supported by the elite companion cavalry. Upon stepping onto Persian soil, Alexander cast his spear into the earth, declaring that he accepted Asia as a gift from the gods. The first major clash with the Persians occurred at the Granicus River. The Persian satraps had lined the steep banks of the river, waiting to cut the invaders down. Disregarding the advice of his seasoned general, Parmenion, who urged caution, Alexander led a daring cavalry charge straight through the rushing waters and up the muddy banks. He was nearly killed in the hand-to-hand combat that followed, saved only at the last second by his friend, Clytus the Black, who severed the arm of a Persian noble raised to deliver a fatal blow. The Macedonians secured a stunning victory, sending a shockwave through the Persian Empire. Alexander then marched down the coast of Asia Minor, liberating Greek cities and subverting Persian control. It was during this phase of the campaign that he visited the city of Gordium. There stood the legendary Gordian knot, an incredibly complex knot of cornel bark rope tied to a chariot. Prophecy held that whoever could untie the knot would become the ruler of all Asia. Alexander studied the knot for some time, and realizing the futility of trying to untangle it by hand, he drew his sword and slashed through it in a single decisive stroke. This act became the ultimate metaphor for solving a seemingly intractable problem with bold, direct action. By 333 BC, the Persian great king, Darius III, realized that this young Macedonian king was a mortal threat. Darius assembled a massive army, numbering well over 100,000 men, and marched to meet Alexander personally. The two armies clashed at the Battle of Issus, fought on a narrow coastal plain bordered by the mountains and the sea. The confined space neutralized Darius's numerical advantage. Alexander, spotting Darius's royal chariot in the center of the Persian lines, led a fierce cavalry charge directly at the great king. Panic seized Darius, and he fled the battlefield, causing his vast army to collapse in chaos. In his haste, Darius abandoned his mother, his wife, and his children. Rather than mistreating the royal captives, Alexander treated them with immense dignity and respect, earning their lifelong admiration. Instead of pursuing Darius immediately into the heart of Persia, Alexander chose to secure the Mediterranean coast to prevent any Persian naval counterattack. This led him to the island city of Tyre, a heavily fortified stronghold that deemed itself impregnable. The Tyrians defied Alexander, prompting one of the most brilliant engineering feats in military history. Over a period of 7 months, Alexander's army built a massive earthen causeway, a mole, through the sea from the mainland to the island, bringing up colossal siege towers and battering rams to breach the city's walls. When Tyre finally fell, Alexander's wrath was terrible. Thousands were executed and the rest sold into slavery. Next, Alexander marched into Egypt, where he was welcomed not as a conqueror, but as a liberator from Persian oppression. In the winter of 331 BC, he founded the city of Alexandria, the first and most famous of many cities bearing his name, which would grow into the greatest cultural and intellectual hub of the ancient Mediterranean. Deeply spiritual, Alexander made a perilous trek across the brutal western desert to the isolated oasis of Siwa to consult the famous oracle of Ammon. The high priest of the oracle welcomed him, addressing him as the son of Zeus Ammon. This divine confirmation profoundly affected Alexander's psyche, cementing his belief in his own divinity and cosmic destiny. Leaving Egypt, Alexander marched into Mesopotamia for the final, decisive showdown with Darius III. In 331 BC, on the vast, flat plains of Gaugamela, Darius had assembled an immense, diverse army from every corner of his empire, complete with scythed chariots and war elephants. Darius had deliberately chosen a wide, flat battlefield to maximize his numbers and allow his cavalry to encircle the smaller Macedonian army. Parmenion once again advised a cautious night attack, but Alexander famously replied, "I will not steal my victory." The Battle of Gaugamela was a masterpiece of military tactics. Alexander deployed his lines at an angle, baiting the Persian cavalry to move outward and create a gap in their center. The moment the gap opened, Alexander formed his elite cavalry into a wedge and charged directly at Darius. Once again, looking into the eyes of the Macedonian king, rushing through the dust and blood, Darius lost his nerve and fled. The Persian line shattered, and the empire was effectively won. Alexander was crowned King of Asia. He marched triumphantly into Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of the Persian Empire. In Persepolis, after months of celebration, the magnificent royal palace was burned to the ground. Whether it was a deliberate act of political revenge for the Persian burning of Athens decades earlier, or a tragic, drunken accident fueled by wine and revelry, the flames signified the definitive end of the Achaemenid Empire. Darius was still at large, fleeing into the eastern provinces. Alexander pursued him relentlessly across rugged terrain. However, before Alexander could capture him, Darius was betrayed, stabbed, and left to die by one of his own satraps, Bessus. When Alexander found Darius's lifeless body, he showed genuine sorrow, covering the dead king with his own royal cloak and ordering that Darius be buried with full royal honors in the tombs of his ancestors. Alexander then hunted down Bessus, executing him brutally for his treason. With the death of Darius, Alexander increasingly began to view himself not just as the king of Macedonia, but as the legitimate successor to the Persian throne. He began adopting Persian royal dress, customs, and court etiquette, including the practice of proskynesis, which required subjects to bow prostrate before the king. This caused profound resentment among his Macedonian veterans, who viewed these customs as effeminate and blasphemous. To them, a king was a first among equals, not a living god. Conspiracies began to surface, testing Alexander's temper, which was growing increasingly volatile. A plot involving the son of his loyal general Parmenion led to the execution of both father and son, shaking the army's trust. The darkest moment of this internal tension occurred in 328 BC in Samarkand during a night of heavy drinking. Alexander got into a fierce, alcohol-fueled argument with Clitus the Black, the very man who had saved his life at the Granicus River. Clitus mocked Alexander's adoption of Persian ways and claimed that his achievements belonged to his father Philip and the Macedonian veterans. In a fit of blind rage, Alexander snatched a pike from a guard and drove it through Clitus's chest. The moment Clitus fell, Alexander was seized with overwhelming remorse, weeping over the body of his friend for days and refusing to eat. Despite the growing weariness of his men, Alexander's thirst for conquest was unquenchable. He pushed farther east into the rugged, untamed lands of Sogdiana and Bactria, fighting a brutal guerrilla war against local tribal leaders. To cement a political alliance and win the loyalty of the region, he married Roxana, a beautiful Bactrian princess. In 327 BC, Alexander turned his gaze toward India, a land shrouded in myth and mystery to the Greeks, who believed it was the edge of the inhabited world. He crossed the Hindu Kush and entered the Punjab region. In 326 BC, he faced his toughest military challenge yet at the Battle of the Hydaspes River against King Porus, a towering ruler who commanded an army reinforced by 200 terrifying war elephants. Under torrential monsoon rains, Alexander executed a brilliant night crossing of the flooded river, catching Porus by surprise. The battle was a horrific, bloody slog. The Macedonian phalanx had to hack through the trunks of the elephants, which trampled men to pieces. Alexander eventually secured a costly victory. Impressed by King Porus's incredible bravery and noble bearing during the battle, Alexander asked him how he wished to be treated. Porus replied, "Treat me, Alexander, like a king." Alexander did just that, leaving Porus in power and expanding his territory. It was during this campaign that Alexander suffered a heartbreaking personal loss. His beloved horse, Bucephalus, died of old age and exhaustion from wounds sustained in the battle. Devastated, Alexander founded a city on the banks of the river and named it Bucephala in honor of his loyal steed. Alexander wished to push even deeper into India, eager to reach the great outer sea that he believed lay just beyond the horizon. But at the Hyphasis River, his men reached their absolute breaking point. They had marched over 17,000 miles, endured 8 years of continuous campaigning, and were terrified by rumors of even larger armies and thousands more war elephants waiting for them across the Ganges. For the first time, the army mutinied, refusing to go any further. They begged their king to let them return home to see their families. Alexander was furious and deeply hurt. He retreated to his royal tent for 3 days, hoping his men would change their minds. When they stood firm, he finally relented, realizing that even his iron will could not command an exhausted army. He famously wept because there were no more worlds to conquer, and turned back. The journey back was a grueling nightmare. Alexander chose to explore the Indus River to the ocean, and then split his forces. One part sailed by sea under the command of Admiral Nearchus, while Alexander led the rest through the Gedrosian Desert, an inhospitable, sun-scorched wasteland in modern-day Pakistan and Iran. The march through the desert was a catastrophe, costing the lives of thousands of soldiers, women, and children who followed the camp due to extreme heat, dehydration, and sudden flash floods. Throughout this ordeal, Alexander shared every hardship with his men, famously refusing a helmet of water offered to him by a soldier, pouring it out onto the sand to show his troops that he would not drink while they still suffered. By 324 BC, Alexander returned to Susa. To unite his vast empire and merge Greek and Persian cultures into a single entity, he organized the Susa weddings, a massive mass marriage ceremony where 80 high-ranking Macedonian officers were wedded to Persian noblewomen. Alexander himself took Darius's daughter, Statera, as his second wife. Later that year, tragedy struck Alexander once again. His closest childhood friend, companion, and presumed lover, Hephaestion, fell ill with a violent fever and died in Ecbatana. Alexander's grief was monumental and borderline psychotic. He cut his hair, executed the physician who failed to save him, banned all music across the empire, and spent vast fortunes planning an extravagant funeral pyre. The loss of Hephaestion seemed to break Alexander's spirit, leaving him increasingly paranoid, reckless, and deeply depressed. In the spring of 323 BC, Alexander returned to the ancient city of Babylon, planning his next grand campaign, an invasion of the Arabian Peninsula. But his time had run out. During a prolonged banquet filled with heavy drinking, Alexander suddenly fell ill with a severe fever. Over the next 11 days, his condition deteriorated rapidly. As he lay on his deathbed, unable to speak, his anxious Macedonian veterans filed past him in silence, weeping for their commander. When his generals finally asked him to whom he left his vast empire, the dying king reportedly whispered, "To the strongest." Alexander the Great died on June 10th or 11th, 323 BC, just a few months shy of his 33rd birthday. The exact cause of his death remains one of history's greatest mysteries, with theories ranging from typhoid fever, malaria, and West Nile virus to poison administered by political rivals, or liver failure brought on by heavy drinking. Following his death, without a clear successor, Alexander's empire was instantly torn apart by decades of civil war, as his generals, known as the Diadochi, fought ruthlessly for control. Roxana and Alexander's unborn son, Alexander IV, were eventually murdered, ending his direct bloodline. His empire was fractured into several powerful Hellenistic kingdoms, including the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt and the Seleucid Empire in the Middle East. Though his empire split apart almost immediately, Alexander's impact on human civilization was permanent. His conquests initiated the Hellenistic period, an era characterized by the profound blending of Greek culture with the traditions of Egypt, Persia, and India. Greek became the lingua franca of the ancient world, enabling the spread of science, philosophy, and art across vast distances. For centuries, military commanders from Julius Caesar to Napoleon Bonaparte would study Alexander's campaigns, viewing him as the ultimate standard of military genius. Alexander was a man of intense contradictions, a visionary philosopher king who built cities and patronized the arts, yet a ruthless conqueror capable of terrifying violence and destruction. A man who conquered the known world, but could never quite conquer his own inner demons. Through it all, he achieved exactly what he set out to do as a young boy reading the Iliad under the stars of Macedonia. He transcended mortality, carving his name indelibly into the fabric of time, ensuring that as long as history is remembered, the world will never forget the name of Alexander the Great.